Judge orders mute veteran to speak. During sentencing, what happens next? Leaves the court in tears. Courtroom 302 of the Riverside County Courthouse was unusually crowded that Thursday morning. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long rectangles of light across the worn wooden floor. The air conditioning hummed ineffectively against the summer heat, and spectators fanned themselves with folded papers as they waited for proceedings to begin. Journalists occupied the back row, pens poised over notepads, while uniformed police officers stood at strategic points around the perimeter. At the defendant's table sat former Marine Staff Sergeant Michael Reeves, his posture military straight, despite the wheelchair that had been his constant companion for the past 18 months. At 34, his once powerful frame had grown leaner, but his presence remained commanding. Burned scars marked the left side of his face and disappeared beneath the collar of his crisp blue shirt. His eyes, the right one bright blue, the left clouded and unseeing, stared straight ahead, focused on some middle distance that no one else could perceive. Michael hadn't spoken a single word since the IED explosion in Fallujah that killed 3 members of his squad and left him with traumatic brain injury, partial paralysis, and severe damage to his vocal cords. The military doctors called it psychogenic mutism, a physical ability to speak rendered inaccessible by psychological trauma. 18 months of therapy had yielded no breakthrough. Michael communicated through writing gestures and occasionally a text-to-speech app on the tablet that now rested on the table before him. Before the explosion, Michael had been a decorated Marine with 15 years of service, known for his leadership and the fierce loyalty he inspired in his troops. Born to a single mother in rural Kentucky, he had joined the military straight out of high school, finding in the Corps the structure and purpose his childhood had lacked. 4 deployments had honed him into a skilled tactician and respected leader. The 5th deployment had broken him in ways that transcended his physical injuries. Now, in a cruel twist of fate, Michael sat awaiting sentencing for aggravated assault. 6 months earlier, during a PTSD episode triggered by a car backfiring near the VA hospital, he had attacked a nurse who had tried to restrain him. Though the nurse had suffered only minor injuries and had even testified on Michael's behalf, explaining that the incident was clearly the result of his combat trauma, the prosecutor had pursued the case aggressively. Michael had pleaded guilty, accepting responsibility in the only way he could through a written statement his attorney had read to the court. Judge Malcolm Harrison, a Vietnam veteran himself with 30 years on the bench, studied Michael from beneath bushy gray eyebrows. The case troubled him deeply. The law demanded consequences for violence, but Harrison couldn't ignore the circumstances that had led to this moment. The pre-sentencing report detailed Michael's exemplary military record, his ongoing medical struggles, and the unanimous opinion of his doctors that incarceration would devastate his already fragile recovery. As the bailiff called the court to order, Judge Harrison made a decision that would alter the course of many lives, including his own. He would require something that seemed impossible, something that might either break Michael Reeves completely or offer him a path to redemption. All rise. The Honorable Judge Malcolm Harrison presiding. The courtroom rose as one then settled back as the judge took his seat. Michael's attorney, Rebecca Chen, a public defender known for her tenacity, squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. At the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney James Wilson shuffled papers with practiced efficiency. Case number 2023 CR 4I872, State versus Michael Reeves, the clerk announced. Sentencing hearing. Judge Harrison nodded. Ms. Chen, Mr. Wilson, are we ready to proceed? Both attorneys confirmed they were. The judge then turned his attention directly to Michael. Staff Sergeant Reeves, he began deliberately using Michael's military rank. Before I pronounce sentence, I want to hear from you. Rebecca Chen immediately rose. Your Honor, as the court is aware, my client is unable to speak due to injuries sustained in combat. We've submitted his written statement, which I'm prepared to read again for the record. Judge Harrison held up a hand. I've read the statement, Ms. Chen. It's eloquent and clearly expresses remorse. But I want to hear from Staff Sergeant Reeves himself. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Michael's hands tightened on the arms of his wheelchair. Your Honor, Chen protested, this is impossible. My client has not spoken since his injury. The medical reports clearly state, I've read the reports, Harrison interrupted. I understand the diagnosis of psychogenic mutism. I also understand that physically, his vocal cords have healed sufficiently to permit speech. The barrier is psychological. With respect, Your Honor, that doesn't make it any less real. I'm not suggesting it does. The judge leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Michael. Staff Sergeant, I've spent considerable time reviewing your case. Your service record is exemplary. The circumstances that brought you to my courtroom are tragic on multiple levels. Before I decide your sentence, I need to hear your voice, not your words filtered through your attorney, not text generated by a machine, but your own voice telling this court why I should show leniency. Michael's face remained impassive, but his right hand moved to the tablet fingers hovering over the screen. No, Staff Sergeant, Harrison said firmly, not the device. I want you to speak. You have until tomorrow morning. Rebecca Chen was on her feet again. Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. You're asking the impossible of my client. His medical condition is noted. Harrison finished for her. But I've consulted with experts who believe that in cases like Staff Sergeant Reeves, the right motivation might overcome the psychological barrier. I'm providing that motivation. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. Court is adjourned until then. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that seemed to echo Michael's internal turmoil. As the courtroom began to empty, he remained motionless in his wheelchair, his expression unreadable. In the hallway outside, Rebecca couldn't contain her outrage. This is judicial overreach, Michael. We can file a complaint request another judge. Michael shook his head firmly and reached for his tablet. His fingers moved quickly across the screen. No, he's offering me a chance. A chance to do what failed publicly. This is setting you up for humiliation. Maybe, or maybe he sees something I don't. Rebecca sighed, her anger deflating somewhat. What are you going to do? Michael's response was simple. Try. That afternoon, Michael found himself in the small apartment he shared with his younger brother David, who had become his caregiver after the injury. The apartment was modest, but meticulously organized, a habit both brothers had inherited from their military service, David having served 4 years in the Army before becoming a paramedic. He can't legally require you to speak, David argued as he prepared dinner. Rebecca's right. We could fight this. Michael sat at the kitchen table, his notebook open before him. He had written a single word: how. It was the question that had haunted him for 18 months. How could he force sound from a throat that seemed to close off at the mere attempt? How could he push past the wall of ice that formed in his mind whenever he tried to speak? The VA speech therapists had tried everything: breathing exercises, visualization techniques, even hypnotherapy. Nothing had broken through the silence. As evening fell, Michael wheeled himself onto the small balcony overlooking the city. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, reminding him of desert sunsets in Iraq. He closed his eyes, remembering the voices of his squad Jones with his Texas drawl Martinez and his rapid-fire Spanish, when excited young, with her clear, commanding tone that could cut through the chaos of combat. All those voices silenced forever, while his remained trapped inside him, unused. Michael opened his eyes and made a decision. He pulled out his phone and sent a text to Dr. Eleanor Patel, the speech therapist who had worked with him most consistently at the VA. Within minutes, she called back. "Michael, is everything all right?" He tapped once on the phone, their established signal for yes. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" 2 taps, no. "Do you need to see me tomorrow Saturday, but I could meet you at the clinic?" 1 tap. "Morning, say 7 a.m. 1 tap. "I'll be there. Try to get some rest, Michael." As he ended the call, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in months. A flicker of hope, small but persistent, like a distant signal fire on a dark night. The VA Medical Center was quiet at 7 a.m. on Saturday, the therapy wing nearly deserted. Dr. Patel was waiting in her office when Michael arrived, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her expression warm but concerned. "Your text was cryptic," she said as she closed the door behind him. "Something about court and needing to speak by Monday." Michael handed her a newspaper clipping of yesterday's hearing, which had made the local news. Dr. Patel read it quickly, her eyebrows rising. "Judge Harrison is unorthodox," she said carefully, "but not entirely wrong. We've discussed before that your mutism is potentially reversible with the right approach." She set the clipping aside. "The question is whether external pressure like this is helpful or harmful." Michael pulled out his notebook and wrote, "I need to try." Dr. Patel studied him for a long moment. "Okay, but we do this my way. No forcing, no straining. That could cause physical damage. We'll use a different approach than we've tried before." For the next hour, they worked through a series of exercises designed not to produce immediate speech, but to reduce the psychological barriers associated with it. Dr. Patel had Michael focus on breathing patterns, then on forming mouth shapes without attempting sound. Finally, she introduced a technique she called shadow speaking, having Michael mouth words while she spoke them aloud, creating an auditory association without the pressure of producing sound himself. "The brain is remarkable," she explained as they took a break. "It creates pathways around damage, but sometimes it also creates barriers as protection. Your brain associated speaking with the trauma you experienced. We need to create new associations." By mid-morning, Michael was exhausted but determined. Dr. Patel suggested they continue the next day, but he shook his head firmly. Time was too short. After a brief rest, They moved to what Dr. Patel called emotional anchoring. She had Michael write down names of people who made him feel safe. His brother David topped the list, followed by several members of his former squad, both living and dead. "Close your eyes," she instructed. "Imagine David is here. You need to tell him something simple, water or help. Feel the safety of his presence. There's no danger, no judgment." Michael tried focusing on his brother's face, the unconditional support David had provided through the darkest months of recovery. He shaped the word water. With his mouth tried to push air through his vocal cords and felt the familiar freezing sensation, the tightness in his throat that prevented sound. Dr. Patel noticed his frustration. "Let's take a different approach. Instead of trying to speak, try to make any sound. A hum, a sigh." They worked through the afternoon with brief periods of progress, followed by setbacks. By evening, Michael could produce a barely audible hum, not speech, but the first voluntary sound he had made in 18 months. It was both a victory and a stark reminder of how far he had to go before Monday morning. Sunday brought renewed determination. David drove Michael back to the VA where Dr. Patel was waiting, despite it being her day off. They continued with the exercises, focusing now on converting the hum into distinct sounds. The vowel ah is physically the easiest to produce, Dr. Patel explained. It requires minimal constriction of the vocal tract. Hour after hour they worked. By noon, Michael could produce a whispered ah sound. By mid-afternoon, he had added oh. Each sound required immense concentration and left him drained, but the progress, however minimal, fueled his determination. News of Michael's efforts had spread through the VA. Several nurses and doctors who had treated him after his return from Iraq stopped by to offer encouragement. Among them was Sandra Collins, the nurse he had injured during his PTSD episode. Her presence initially filled Michael with shame, but she approached him without hesitation. "I heard what the judge is asking you to do," she said simply. "I want you to know I'll be there tomorrow, not to judge you, but to support you." Her forgiveness, so freely given, affected Michael deeply. That afternoon, working with Dr. Patel, he managed his first consonant sound, a soft M, that when combined with the vowels he had mastered, allowed him to whisper ma and mo. "This is remarkable progress," Dr. Patel told him as their session ended. "But Michael, I need to be honest with you. Speaking actual words in court tomorrow, forming sentences, it may not be possible yet. The stress of the courtroom environment could trigger the psychological blocks we've been working to overcome." Michael nodded his understanding. He knew the odds were against him, but he also knew he had to try, not just for the judge's benefit, not even for his own freedom, but for something more fundamental, to reclaim a part of himself that had been lost in that explosion in Fallujah. That night, unable to sleep, Michael sat in the living room of the apartment surrounded by photographs, his squad in Iraq, his mother who had passed away while he was on his third deployment, David in his Army uniform. He picked up a group photo taken just days before the explosion, studying the faces of Jones, Martinez, and Young, the three who hadn't made it home. "I'm trying," he whispered soundlessly to their images. "Help me find the words." Monday morning arrived with a sense of inevitability. The courthouse seemed more imposing than ever as David helped Michael from the car into his wheelchair. Rebecca Chen met them at the entrance, her expression a mixture of concern and professional determination. "Michael, I've prepared a motion explaining the medical impossibility of what Judge Harrison is asking," she said as they moved through security. "We can file it immediately if you changed your mind about challenging his order." Michael shook his head firmly. He had come too far to back down now. The courtroom was even more crowded than it had been on Friday. Word of the judge's unusual demand had spread, drawing additional media attention and spectators. Michael recognized several veterans in the gallery, including members of his former unit. Sandra Collins sat near the front, offering a small smile of encouragement as he passed. Dr. Patel had arrived early and was speaking quietly with Rebecca. She had brought medical documentation of Michael's progress over the weekend, hoping it might satisfy the judge even if Michael couldn't speak, as ordered. All rise. The Honorable Judge Malcolm Harrison presiding. The familiar ritual played out, and then Judge Harrison was looking directly at Michael, his expression unreadable. "Staff Sergeant Reeves, when we adjourned on Friday, I gave you a specific instruction. Are you prepared to address the court?" Rebecca Chen rose quickly. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit documentation from Dr. Eleanor Patel, Staff Sergeant Reeves' speech therapist at the VA. It details the extraordinary efforts my client has made over the weekend to comply with your order, as well as the medical limitations that—" "I'll review the documentation," Harrison interrupted, "but my question was directed to Staff Sergeant Reeves." His gaze never left Michael. "Are you prepared to speak to this court?" The courtroom fell silent. Michael could feel the weight of every gaze upon him, the judge's expectation, Rebecca's concern, the curiosity of the spectators, the support of his fellow veterans. His throat felt tight, his chest constricted. The familiar panic began to rise. Slowly, deliberately, Michael nodded. "Very well," Judge Harrison said. "The court will hear your statement regarding sentencing." Michael closed his eyes briefly, centering himself as Dr. Patel had taught him. He visualized his squad, imagined them surrounding him, supporting him. He thought of David's unwavering faith, of Sandra Collins' forgiveness, of Dr. Patel's patient guidance. He opened his eyes, looked directly at the judge, and opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable. Someone coughed. A reporter shifted in his seat. Michael tried again, focusing on the simple sounds he had mastered. His lips formed the shape for "I," but no sound emerged. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His right hand gripped the arm of his wheelchair so tightly his knuckles whitened. Judge Harrison's expression softened slightly. "Take your time, Staff Sergeant." Michael closed his eyes again, trying to calm the racing of his heart. The courtroom seemed to recede around him, and in his mind, he was back in the desert surrounded by his squad. Jones, with his easy smile. Martinez, always ready with a joke. Young, whose quiet competence had saved them countless times. He opened his eyes, fixed his gaze on a point just above the judge's head, and tried once more. This time, a sound emerged, barely audible, more breath than voice, but unmistakably human. "Ah." The single syllable hung in the air. Michael paused, gathering his strength, then continued each word, a battle won through sheer force of will. "I am sorry." The words were raspy, halting, painful to produce, and almost as difficult to hear. But they were his words and his voice breaking through 18 months of silence. Rebecca Chen's hand flew to her mouth. In the gallery, David leaned forward, his eyes wide with disbelief and hope. Dr. Patel nodded encouragingly, her professional demeanor briefly overcome by emotion. Michael continued, each word requiring immense concentration. "I hurt someone who helped me." He paused, drawing a labored breath. "No excuse." Judge Harrison leaned forward, his attention completely focused on Michael. "Go on, Staff Sergeant." Michael's next attempt ended in a fit of coughing. David half rose from his seat, but Michael waved him back, determined to continue on his own. When he spoke again, his voice was slightly stronger, as if the act of speaking was gradually breaking through long, frozen pathways. "In Fallujah, I couldn't save them." The simple statement carried the weight of all his guilt, all his trauma. In the gallery, several veterans nodded in understanding, some wiping away tears. "The explosion took my words." Michael gestured to his scarred face, his wheelchair. "Took more than that." He paused again, visibly struggling. Judge Harrison waited patiently, making no move to interrupt or hurry him. "When the car backfired," Michael continued, referring to the incident at the VA, "I was back there, not seeing Nurse Collins, seeing enemies." Sandra Collins nodded from her place in the gallery, tears streaming down her face. "Not asking for freedom," Michael said, his voice growing slightly stronger with each word, as if the act of speaking was breaking through long, frozen neural pathways. "Asking for chance to make amends." With those words, Michael fell silent, physically and emotionally exhausted. The effort of speaking had drained him completely, but something had changed in his eyes, a spark of the man he had been before the explosion, before the silence. Judge Harrison sat motionless for a long moment, the courtroom utterly still around him. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "In 30 years on this bench, I have never witnessed such courage," he said quietly. "Thank you, Staff Sergeant Reeves." The judge called a 30-minute recess, during which Michael was surrounded by support. David knelt beside his wheelchair, speechless with emotion. Dr. Patel conducted a quick examination, concerned that the strain might have damaged his healing vocal cords. Rebecca Chen conferred urgently with colleagues about what this development might mean for sentencing. "Your vocal cords seem intact," Dr. Patel told Michael, her professional demeanor returning despite the tears that had briefly overwhelmed her. "But please, don't push further today. You've accomplished something remarkable." Michael nodded, exhausted, but with a new sense of purpose. On his tablet, he typed a question for Rebecca. "What happens now?" "Honestly, I don't know," she admitted. "Judge Harrison is unpredictable, but what you did, it changes things. He saw exactly what I've been trying to tell the court all along, that you're fighting to recover, to make amends." When court resumed, the atmosphere had shifted perceptibly. Even Assistant District Attorney Wilson seemed affected by what had transpired. His earlier rigid posture softened somewhat. Judge Harrison called the court to order and addressed Michael directly. "Staff Sergeant Reeves, before I pronounce sentence, there's something I believe the court should hear." He turned to the gallery. "Nurse Collins, would you be willing to address the court regarding the incident?" Sandra Collins rose, smoothing her uniform nervously. Yes, Your Honor. Please approach the witness stand. After being sworn in, Sandra Collins looked directly at Michael as she spoke. I've worked at the VA for 15 years. I've seen countless veterans struggling with PTSD and traumatic brain injuries. What happened with Staff Sergeant Reeves wasn't personal. It wasn't even about me. He was trapped in a flashback defending himself against threats only he could see. You were injured, Judge Harrison noted. A sprained wrist and some bruises, she acknowledged. But the real injury was to him the setback to his recovery, the shame and guilt he's carried since that day. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Your Honor, I'm not just here as the victim in this case. I'm here as a medical professional who believes that incarceration would destroy the progress Staff Sergeant Reeves has made. What we just witnessed, his ability to speak after 18 months of silence, that's a breakthrough that could be the beginning of real recovery. Prison would end that possibility. Thank you, Nurse Collins, the judge said. You may step down. Next, Judge Harrison called Dr. Patel to testify about the medical significance of Michael's speech. She explained the nature of psychogenic mutism and the extraordinary effort it had taken for Michael to break through it. In my professional opinion, she concluded, what we witnessed today wasn't just compliance with a court order. It was a breakthrough that could lead to significant recovery, but only in the right environment with consistent therapy and support. As Dr. Patel returned to her seat, Judge Harrison addressed the Assistant District Attorney. Mr. Wilson, has the state's position on sentencing changed in light of today's developments? Wilson stood looking somewhat conflicted. Your Honor, the state recognizes the unique circumstances of this case. While we maintain that consequences are necessary for violent actions, we are not opposed to a sentence that emphasizes rehabilitation over incarceration, provided there are strict conditions to ensure public safety. This concession, unexpected from the prosecutor who had pursued the case so aggressively, sent a ripple of hope through Michael's supporters. Judge Harrison nodded, then turned his attention back to Michael. Staff Sergeant Reeves, do you wish to say anything further before I pronounce sentence? Michael looked to Dr. Patel, who gave a small shake of her head, concerned about further strain on his vocal cords. He turned to his tablet instead, typing a message that Rebecca read aloud. I broke my silence today because I needed to take responsibility with my own voice. Whatever your decision, that won't change. I will continue to work every day to make amends to Nurse Collins, to my community, and to the memory of those I couldn't save. Judge Harrison considered these words, then straightened in his chair, his decision made. Staff Sergeant Michael Reeves, please rise for sentencing. David moved to help his brother stand, supporting him as Michael pushed himself up from the wheelchair, determined to receive his sentence on his feet as a sign of respect to the court. Having considered all factors in this case, including your military service, the nature of your injuries, the circumstances of the offense, the victim's testimony, and your evident remorse and commitment to rehabilitation, I hereby sentence you as follows. The courtroom held its collective breath. 3 years probation, during which time you will continue treatment at the VA for both your physical injuries and PTSD. You will perform 500 hours of community service, which may include speaking to veterans groups about PTSD and recovery when your medical team deems you ready. You will continue weekly sessions with Dr. Patel to build on today's breakthrough, and you will meet monthly with Nurse Collins if she is willing to develop a program to help VA staff better understand and respond to veterans experiencing flashbacks. Judge Harrison paused, making eye contact with Michael. This sentence is not leniency, Staff Sergeant. It is a recognition that justice is not served by incarcerating a wounded warrior who has already lost so much in service to his country. It is also a challenge to continue the fight you began in this courtroom today to reclaim your voice and your life. Michael stood as straight as his injuries allowed, acknowledging the sentence with a nod. There is one more thing, Judge Harrison added. The court recognizes that your actions today required extraordinary courage. Breaking through 18 months of silence in this public forum, facing your trauma head-on, that is the kind of courage we should recognize. The judge reached beneath his robes and produced a small object, a challenge coin, the kind military commanders present for exceptional service. He extended it toward Michael. This was given to me in Vietnam after an action I've never spoken about. I've carried it for 50 years as a reminder that courage comes in many forms. Today, I pass it to you, Staff Sergeant Reeves, in recognition of a different kind of battlefield bravery. Michael hesitated, then stepped forward with David's support to accept the coin. As their hands met in the exchange, something unexpected happened. Michael's lips moved, and a single word emerged stronger than before. Thank you. The simple phrase, so commonplace in normal conversation, so miraculous in this context, seemed to release something in the courtroom. Sandra Collins wiped away tears. David's face shone with pride. Veterans in the gallery stood in silent salute. Even the court reporter paused in her transcription, overcome by the moment. Judge Harrison, his own composure briefly threatened, nodded once and brought down his gavel. Court is adjourned. The media called it the miracle in courtroom 302. Video of Michael's breakthrough went viral, resonating particularly with veterans groups and advocates for trauma survivors. But for Michael himself, that day in court wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. The days immediately following the hearing brought a flood of emotions and challenges. Speaking remained difficult, each word a conscious effort. There were days when the silence returned, when trauma and exhaustion rebuilt the walls that had briefly come down in the courtroom. But there were also moments of progress. A short conversation with David over breakfast, a few words exchanged with Dr. Patel during therapy, the gradual reclamation of a fundamental human ability. 1 month after the hearing, Michael met with Sandra Collins at the VA as required by his probation. What began as an awkward, halting conversation evolved into something unexpected, a collaboration. Sandra had been developing a training program for medical staff on recognizing and responding to PTSD triggers. Michael's perspective as both a veteran and someone who had experienced a severe flashback provided invaluable insight. The hardest part to explain, Michael told her during one of their sessions, his speech still slow but increasingly fluid, is that during a flashback, the present disappears completely. I wasn't seeing you, I was seeing an insurgent in Fallujah. This understanding that PTSD wasn't just intense memory, but a complete displacement of reality, became central to the training program they developed together. Within 6 months, the Collins-Reeves protocol was being implemented at VA hospitals across the state, with plans for national expansion. Michael's community service hours were spent working with a veteran support group, initially just listening, but gradually finding his voice as both a participant and eventually a peer counselor. His journey from silence to speech gave hope to others struggling with different manifestations of trauma. Judge Harrison followed Michael's progress with interest, occasionally attending veterans events where Michael spoke. The challenge coin he had given Michael became a symbol of their unusual connection, a reminder that sometimes justice required looking beyond the letter of the law to the human being standing before the court. On the one-year anniversary of the hearing, Michael returned to courtroom 302, not as a defendant, but as a visitor. The room was empty, except for Judge Harrison, who had agreed to meet him during a lunch recess. "Your Honor," Michael greeted him, his voice now recognizable as his own, though still bearing the raspy quality left by his injuries. "I wanted to thank you in person, not just for the sentence, but for seeing what I couldn't see, that I needed to break through my silence to begin healing." Harrison gestured for Michael to sit. "How are you doing, Staff Sergeant?" "Better," Michael replied simply. "Not fixed. Some days are still difficult, but I'm finding my way back." "And your work with Nurse Collins?" Michael smiled slightly. "The protocol is helping. We've had feedback from dozens of VA facilities reporting fewer escalations, better outcomes." He paused, then added, "She's remarkable, turning what happened between us into something positive." Harrison nodded, studying the man before him. Michael still used a wheelchair, though he could now walk short distances with a cane. The scars on his face had faded somewhat, and his once clouded left eye had regained some clarity. But the most significant change was in his demeanor. The haunted look had receded, replaced by purpose. "I made a gamble that day," Harrison admitted. "Forcing you to speak could have backfired badly. It wasn't by the book." "With respect, sir, neither was giving me your challenge coin." Harrison smiled at that. "No, it wasn't. But sometimes the book doesn't have the right answers." He leaned forward. "I've been on the bench for 3 decades, Staff Sergeant. I've sentenced murderers and shoplifters, con artists, and people who made one terrible mistake. What I've learned is that the law is necessary, but insufficient. Justice needs humanity to be complete." As their meeting concluded, Michael reached into his pocket and produced a small box, which he placed on the judge's desk. "I wanted you to have this." Inside was a challenge coin, newly minted, bearing the emblem of Michael's support group on one side. On the reverse was an inscription, "Courage speaks even in silence." "We give these to veterans when they reach a significant milestone in recovery," Michael explained. "You should have the first one." As Judge Harrison accepted the coin, their roles momentarily reversed, the judge receiving recognition from the man he had once sentenced. It was a small moment, unmarked by cameras or news reports, but significant in its affirmation of their shared humanity. That evening, Michael sat with David on their apartment balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in familiar shades of orange and purple. His voice, though stronger than it had been in the courtroom a year ago, still carried the marks of his injuries, a permanent reminder of all he had lost. "Do you ever regret it?" David asked suddenly. Speaking that day in court, it would have been easier to let Rebecca file that motion challenge the judge's order. Michael considered the question, watching as the last light faded from the sky. When he spoke, his words came slowly, but with certainty. "In the silence, I was still in Fallujah, still in that moment when everything was taken. Speaking, it was like coming home. He turned to his brother, the man who had stood by him through the darkest days. Some wounds never fully heal, but finding my voice again, it gave me back my future. Above them, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that had watched over battlefields and courtrooms, over tragedies and triumphs, over silence and the precious, painful miracle of words finally spoken aloud.